never mind people take part, but from the public's point of view, most members of the public can just about take 4 weeks of an election campaign. About 2.5 years, it's a long, long time. The good thing is, I think people are becoming more focused now. They can see 18th September as a date you can have in front of your mind. Like all elections, anything at the ballot box, those who take part should be profoundly nervous right up until the ballot closes at 10 o'clock on the evening of September the 18th. What's the summer going to be like? Can you imagine? I keep getting afraid I can. We're going to take questions now, so you can all dive in. And we've got a big issue seller, Peter, who's in the... Peter, you're in the front. Where are you? I've lost you. You're there. Right. You can ask the first question. I will intersperse some questions from Herald Scotland readers who've put in things online. Some of them rather good questions, actually. But the rest of you will... Can we get the lights up a wee bit further, or is that the maximum, just so I can see hands going up? And obviously I've got no way of knowing which side of the debate we're on, so it's potluck really. But we'll try to keep it clean and fair. And if I could just say to you, no speeches, simple questions. Peter, first of all.
How will states in the UK impact positively in progress made with the Scottish Government and homelessness?
A homelessness question about what the UK government, and presumably you mean successive governments, have done to advance the cause of reducing homelessness in Scotland. I mean, why does the UK work better on that question than a Scottish government in an independent Scotland would?
Okay, look, I just turn to what I said earlier this evening. At the moment, we're part of the UK, we're part of a large economy, which with the right political will has got the power to spend the money we need to build more houses, to devote the resources to help homeless people make their transition to hopefully get into work, to get into supported accommodation and independently living. That obviously is a political choice. But if, as I said earlier, if we were independent today, and we just heard that we'd lost £4 billion of tax revenues, equivalent to the school's budget, you would not have the money to do those things, even if you had the political will. And that's why there's two things you need if you're going to tackle homelessness or any other problem in relation to housing. One is you need the political will to do it, which is obviously important. But secondly, and critically, you need the money, the resources to do it. And I think we've got a far better chance of doing that within the strength of the United Kingdom than we ever would if we were on our own.
Question up here, and then we'll come down there, and then here. Yeah.
I just wondered if there's any chance of Mr. Darling answering the question you asked about an hour ago, which is, there's probably more than one, but the one I was thinking of was the one, what he's going to do on September the 19th to fight for his constituents as regards pounds.
Well, I'm fighting every day until September the 18th.
That was what I asked you, sorry.
I think that the options of a currency union, which I don't think is going to happen, the euro, Scotland having its own currency, which is hugely risky, or this mad idea of following a Panama example, they're all terrible options, and I don't support any of them. That's why I would rather spend my time not speculating on that, but rather convincing people that having a pound backed up by an economic and political union, which is essential to make the thing work, that is a better option. But can I just put it back on you? Are you happy with the currency union thing, or would you prefer an independent Scottish currency, and if so, why?
I'd probably be happy with the pound, but I just wanted to know...
What do you mean, the pound separate, or the pound in a currency union?
Preferably the pound separate, but even if it's in a currency union, Mr. Darling still hasn't explained what he's going to do to post-referendum to act for his constituents.
Just come back on that. You're asking me to choose between 3 or 4 unpalatable options. I'm just not going to do that. I'm sorry, because they're unpalatable. I think that all of them would have massive disadvantages for Scotland. What isn't hugely advantageous for Scotland, Scottish businesses, us as individuals, is actually having access to the whole of the UK with one currency, which is underpinned by an economic and political union. I know that won't satisfy you in the answer, but that is my answer because that's what I honestly believe. Question here.
Stephen Watson, founder of Academics BS. It was launched 2 weeks ago. So I was hoping to be face to face with academics together in the near future. I have a question which relates to democratic deficit in Scotland as the number since 1945. You're often quoted as saying, as you said again tonight, if you don't like the government in London, you vote them out 5 years hence. So I want to do some data before you, and then have you speak to that data.
Do it in the detail. Come on. I know you're a maths lecturer, but
Since 1945, there's been 18 elections, and in only 2 of those elections has the Scottish law actually determined the majority party. The 1964 and the 1974 election, both of which ran for something like 26 months.
Okay.
The question is, just when you speak of Scotland, when you speak of Scotland's influence, its democratic sense, so what are you referring to? I'm a little puzzled this problem out.
Right. Let me give you some other data which you can ponder on that you'll never agree with me. In the 2010 general election, more people voted for the parties of what is now the coalition government than did for the nationalists in Scotland. And it's a fact. And if you look at actually the nationalists and the Tory vote in Scotland wasn't that far apart, and well behind the Liberals and the Labour Party. And I also chuck another thing in. I think for many people, I don't know you well enough to know whether you believe that, but if you are a nationalist and you believe that's right, I don't suppose you would be any happier in the 13 years there was a Labour government, which also in Scotland, as you know, returned the majority of Labour MPs. Because if you're a nationalist, that really doesn't matter. So I just don't buy this argument that you're advancing. I'm sorry, but I just don't. Question here.
Okay, this relates to oil. The massive Scottish Atlantic margin oil and gas sector contains the biggest oil field in the world west of Lewis. It's been referred to by oil industry experts as the next key global hotspot for oil and gas exploration. Why, therefore, do unionists keep on about declining oil and gas reserves in the Scottish North Sea and ignore the vast Scottish Atlantic margin oil and gas reserves? Also, Scots won't know will have given control of all their enormous oil and gas reserves on the devolution of power to the Scots.
Okay, there's 2 questions there. Firstly, I said that North Sea oil resources are declining, which is a matter of fact because they're not renewable, and every barrel you take out goes one less. I've never argued there aren't other fields. What I would say to you, and it isn't just unionists as you put it, people in the industry and others as well, make the point that if you look at the production of the North Sea, it's about half what it was 10 years ago. It's becoming more expensive to extract the stuff. And there's always going to be competition in terms of investment from the oil companies as to whether or not they choose to go into the waters west of Shetland or west of Lewis, in case you're example, or whether they go to Russia, or whether they go to off the African coast or in the Far East and so on. And there's always going to be these choices. I hope that we can maximise whatever there is in the North Sea. My bigger argument, though, is an independent Scotland would 20% of its tax revenues would be coming from this one source. And as we saw this week, if for whatever reason those revenues drop, if you're a small country and you lose 20% or a big proportion of your 20% of your oil revenues, you have got a real problem. And that is a risk that, I just don't think we should take. As I said earlier on, in the last 5 years, we've had 2 examples of why the security and the strength and the stability of the UK matters. One is in the banking rescue, 2 collapsed Scottish banks, a calamity made in Edinburgh, not in London, and now, this is the second time it's happened in the last decade, a dramatic fall in oil revenues, which would have a profound effect on the very things that my guess is a lot of people in this room like to see money being spent upon. So that's my argument against it. In relation to your final point, yes, there's been a lot of oil revenues, but remember, spending per head in Scotland is about £1,200 a head more than it is in England. So it's not just a one-way street really look at these things. Right. Question. If we vote no, do we get control of our oil? I don't think any of the political parties, the ones on my side of the island, are proposing that. But if you decide to go down that road, then you also have to accept that the monies that flow. What you'd be getting if you did that was the uncertainty of oil prices against the certainty of the fact that the last 30 years the Bannock formula has ensured that spending per head in Scotland is much higher than it is in England. Well, hang on. Okay, well, it's an interesting point. Let's just deal with that. Sure. The Norway oil policy is often reduced
as the evidence of something we should have done in this country, I mean in the UK, but with respect to Scotland particularly, from the 70s, it wasn't done, it's been a disaster. We could do it as an independent country, why not?
Well,
just deal with that briefly.
Sure, of course I can. Norway is a much higher taxed country than this country. When people talk about Scandinavian levels of welfare state, and then at the same time say you can have Tea Party type taxes, it just doesn't add up. In Norway they do pay more taxes, but that, as I understand, is not what the nationalists are offering, or if they are, they're not telling us. In relation to an oil fund, as you know, last year the nationalists said they wanted to set one up, and then the information that was kept from us that they had to reveal under the Freedom of Information Act was, in order to set one up, we'd had to borrow money to put into it, simply because the revenues wouldn't allow you to do that just now. It actually cost you more to borrow that money to save. It was a bit like going to a loan shark to borrow money to put into an ISA. It doesn't really make any sense. So whatever should have happened in the 1970s, trying to set up an oil fund now would mean you would have, if you're saving money, you can't spend it. And if you're not going to spend it, people who are arguing that should tell us where they're not going to spend it. Question here, and then up here. Yeah.
Norway was invaded by Germany in April 1940. Without the Defence Force of the United Kingdom, all of Norway's resources would have gone to the Third Reich. Could you comment on the advantages of having a UK defence system?
Well, that's a devastating question. Anyway, it gets sort of.
That is just incredible. That is just too much. Too much. I have no idea.
Sharing the resources as a large country, one of the largest countries in the world, we can afford to maintain an army, a navy, an air force, which in Scotland benefits because all that spending actually takes place in spending, not least in building ships on the Clyde of the Royal Navy. Most of the Royal Navy went into another country. So yeah, there is an advantage of that. Again, as someone who's Scottish, I can't see that's the point of ending up in a situation where we have to pay disproportionately more to maintain some sort of armed forces, naval, air force, or something. Actually, to the issue of sharing, which is, if you've got the nationalists who are in favour of joining NATO, that's sharing resources. Why are they not willing to share them with our next door neighbours? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Let me put a question from one of the Scotland readers who's done this by email. It's from Russell Vallant, and I'll just read it out as it came in. Between 800,000 and 900,000 people born in Scotland live south of the border, he says. Countries as diverse as Spain and Finland allow expats a postal vote in the municipality of their birth. A sixth of the Scottish nation is being denied a vote in this referendum. Do you, Alistair Darling, agree that this vote has nothing to do with Scots living elsewhere in the UK? Or is it, as he puts it, that the politicians of both camps don't want to include the forgotten sixth because they don't know how they might vote?
Well, I think what I do find rather irritating is that I was speaking to a French constituent of mine, there's a Frenchman who lives in Edinburgh, who's got a vote. And I was speaking to someone 2 weeks ago in Edinburgh whose firm sent him down to London for 4 years, and he's had it, and hasn't got a vote. And as he said, I could leave Scotland, as a member of the UK, I'll come back as a foreigner, and I've got no vote. Now, the problem is, when this deal was fixed, I referred to earlier on, the franchise was the franchise that elects the Scottish government.
And how you deal with it is very difficult.
Where there is clearly a difficulty is that you could easily enough spot someone temporarily there. It's the same way now. If anyone here goes to, say, work in Brussels, as long as you're on the electoral roll, you can get a postal vote. Whereas, because it's in the UK, it means you have a vote from general electoral, wherever you have to be. The problem's never arisen. And honestly, I'm afraid it's a problem that I don't think it's really capable of being fixed now. But it is unfair because there's lots of people in Scotland who actually, have every intention of coming back at some stage. It's their country too.
There's a related question that interests me, and I'll come back to you in a second, but both the First Minister and Nicola Sturgeon have said that they accept that on the question of a currency union, there is an interest among those who will be in the other party, i.e. the 90% of the other people who will use sterling in the event of a currency union after a yes vote, if that were to happen. And we know what George Osborne said, but let's not revisit that. The question is, how do you ascertain what their view is? should they have a referendum? Is it done by manifestos of the political parties where they're elected? I mean, if they have a democratic right to be consulted on this, how should it be done?
Well, look, I won't repeat what I said about the currency union, but I think that on a thing like this, given how much controversy there is today about, the Eurozone, it's inconceivable that any political party in the rest of the UK could ever enter into any sort of union without asking its people. Because you're saying to them, you are no longer sovereign.
So you're saying that if there were a yes vote, and if the argument from Scotland was there should be a currency union, there would be a referendum in the rest of the UK.
What I've said to you is that the three parties that are likely to form a government,
yes,
well, already made it clear we're not doing it. Therefore, we're not going to seek a mandate for it. What I just find, you mentioned Alex Allen, Alex Allen actually said the other day he didn't think that the rest of the UK should ask its people. It seems an extraordinary view to take. I don't think, if we were to join the Euro, I'm pretty sure this was our party's policy, so I'm not going to stray off the line message too much.
We've made it
clear that if you join the Euro, you have to have a referendum about it because it's a big constitutional change. And I think if you're going to change something fundamentally in your constitution, you should have a referendum. But as I said to you earlier, the three parties have made it absolutely clear there will not be.
No, but that's a very interesting observation, because what you're saying is that even if you don't believe that the objection of the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, and the Liberal Democrats to a currency union is absolute, the very least you could expect would that if the proposal were put after a yes vote for a currency union, they would be justified, and indeed in practical terms would have to put it to the people of the rest of the UK in a referendum.
Let me say this to you. If there were a yes vote in September, Alex Allen said it's going to be 18 months yet, everything get fixed. My guess is that in the general election, which has to be held in May of next year, there will be a whole slew of policies that the parties would seek a mandate for in any negotiation on Europe, on how you divide up the assets of the armed forces.
They would be in the manifesto.
Unless for a big thing where you're actually making huge changes, if you don't have it in the manifesto, you run into all sorts of difficulties because people said, look, you never told us you were going to do this. I think in relation to the currency union, what the three of them have said is that there are such fundamental objections, they're not going to agree to it. You certainly don't put into your manifesto something you have no intention of doing. You don't. The question doesn't arise. Therefore, I'm just making a general observation that it is right for us to have a referendum on these things. If you can't then say to the rest of the country, actually, you're not allowed to have a referendum on things that you want. But as I say, the question is academic as far as this is concerned, because it isn't going to happen.
Up here. Who's there? And then yeah, just whoever you can find.
Hi, Alistair Darling, thanks for your interview. It was interesting. I'm going to vote no in the referendum. Just as an observation was, you talk a lot about the downsides of independence, and it's important to highlight that, and I do agree with a lot of what you say. But there's also, I think, a very positive and powerful case for staying part of the United Kingdom. And I just feel that's not being articulated well enough. I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
How do you make no exciting?
Well, I agree with what you're saying, that that the advantages of being part of the UK are as an important part of our argument.
Yeah, no, it's the point.
I think there's two things I'd say. The opportunities that come from being part of something bigger. We've got the best of both worlds, deciding things like health and education here, but you've also got the strengths and opportunities that come, and the possibilities of making things so much better in the UK are something that we should value and we should treasure. And equally, having the security that is there is something that, for someone like me and others who believe passionately in making sure that we look after everyone in this country, having that resource important is very, very important. I will tell you though, on a
afraid it's a matter of fact. I did last year make a speech of 50 minutes worth, not a single criticism of the other side, not a word of criticism of what they were saying, and guess what? It wasn't, I think it got reported in any newspaper, any television channel.
So what do you do about that?
It's difficult because when you're arguing, when you're saying, look, there are advantages of what we have at the moment, like the opportunities, the security I was referring to. It's people say, well, we know that. Well, maybe we may know that.
Well, come on, you're going to remind people of that. You're up against a great campaigner.
Yes.
In the summer. And he's going to be, every child in Scotland will have a balloon with yes on it. We know that. And what are you going to do? I mean, how do you make yourself exciting?
Balloons don't vote. In most cases. This argument is going to be one, both, as I said earlier, both an emotional arguments in the heart of your life as well as arguments in the head. And I will carry on making the arguments that I believe in, is why I think we're better and stronger together. And yes, those of us on my side of the debate are just as passionate, just as emotional about it. And there are plenty of other people who will be appearing on our platforms who are perhaps more demonstrative than I am on many occasions, who will make that case very, very proud.
Stand by for Boris.
No, I had not got him in mind.
Right,
you'll see shortly.
Right, okay, here we go. Over here.
Hi, my name's Stephen Mann. Really, just to answer one of your questions, Alistair, actually, I'm quite concerned that you didn't really know the answer. So I'll ask the question and I'll give the answer. Why was Ireland allowed to be in currency union when it left the United Kingdom in 1922 right up to 1978? And were there any objections, from the rest of the UK? Did we have any referendum? I don't remember any. I mean, I know I wasn't there. I'm relatively young, but come on.
Interesting question. Right, I didn't answer it because the question wasn't actually asked of me, but since you answered, what happened in Ireland was, after 1931, it wasn't a currency union like the Eurozone. They had a currency board, but they more or less agreed to follow the UK's economic policy up until the Second World War. Now, if you're arguing that independence means we can do things differently, it's very odd to then say, well, we'll lock this off into something where you actually are bound by the economic policies of a larger country. And if you look at the history of what the successive Irish governments did, their economic policy, right up until the time they joined the Euro, was very much geared to following what we were doing. And then, of course, they decided to join the Euro with the difficulties that brought them, particularly the crash that hit Ireland was largely because the interest rate policy that they had suited Germany, that didn't suit Ireland. What was set up in the 1920s is completely different from the sort of currency union that Alexander was talking about.
You want to come back on that?
I just don't buy what you're saying. There's no... there's every possibility that the rest of the UK are going to cave in on this one. It'll be for them.
Can I ask you a question? This is a good argument. I enjoy having a debate with you on this. Suppose you were living in Surbiton, right? And you discovered, because nobody's really talking about it, that with a currency union, Scotland, which had just walked away from the UK because it thought England was holding it back, would potentially have a veto on English tax and spending. Would you think that was a good idea?
It may well be, actually.
Let me take you around the streets of Surbiton sometime to see how we go on.
I was going to come back to you, actually.
Well, make it quick. It's good.
But 1978 is when the Irish decided to go out themselves and form their own currency, and I think that's what may well happen. The UK government allowed Ireland, to work in parity within the sterling zone for 50 odd years. I don't see why, something similar cannot happen.
You're talking about a different thing. You're talking about a situation where Scotland could have its own currency, call it what you want. Of course it can, but frankly, when I say to you this,
actually, I'm not talking about that.
Well, that's what happened after.
What I'm talking about is after the referendum, there'll be a lot of things that will be decided by the Scottish people. But, a lot of things.
Sure, and there'll be a lot of things decided by what will then be a foreign country in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. What you can't do is assume, as Alexander does, that everything he wants he's going to get. It's simply not the case. And in the currency thing, it is so fundamental to everything that to claim that everybody is wrong except him, and we should believe him and nobody else, that beggars belief, frankly.
But let's get someone else in on this. Who's next? Who's got the mic? Yeah, and then get it up there.
Sorry, I'm not talking about that issue. It's a separate thing. Going back to the No campaign, and I was saying to my husband earlier tonight, this will be my 10th event. But it's my first for the Better Together speaker.
What do you mean the other 9 have been yes?
But I noticed that earlier when you said that Alexander wants to make it about him and the Tories, and I think you want to make it about Alexander and keep referring to the Nationalists. I've never voted SNP in my life, but I've been to 10 events, and there's been a broad range of groups. And my question to you, Mr. Darren, is, other than the SNP and Alexander, can you name 5 other groups or political parties that are interested in the yes vote, including Labour for Independence? I'll start you off. Labour for Independence. Who else are you aware of, and what are you aware? Are you actually aware that there are a large number of groups?
I think last year it was fairly fair to say that Labour for Independence is a nationalist organisation. It's not a Labour organisation at all. In relation to the campaign, yes, the Greens are in there, the Scottish Socialists I think are in there, but the reason I refer to Alexander Nationalists, it seems to be, and I think to rather large number of people, that the SNP is by far the majority, dominant force as far as that is concerned. The Greens, for example, have a different policy in currency to Alexander's policy.
Where's the mic? We've got one up here and then back here. Yeah, Karen.
Good evening, Mr. Dyer.
Hello? That's fine. No, come again.
Hello, Mr. Dyer.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'd like to know why, up until George Osborne's announcement, you thought currency union was the common sense way to go.
I didn't.
You said that.
Yes, you did.
I didn't.
Yes, you did.
I know the nationalists distribute something using 2 words I use with some distance between the two of them to try and make out that somehow in favour of it. I'm not criticising you at all for this, because you couldn't expect to listen to everything I've been saying for the last 2 years, but I've always made it clear that I think a current currency union is just nonsense. And one of the points I make a lot of times is, if I believed in Scottish independence, I can't see the point of getting myself into a situation where I'm in a legal straitjacket, where I can be told what I can tax, what I can spend by a much larger country next to me. They have a partner in the currency union. It is just nonsense for Scotland. It's just not in Scotland's interest. Never mind the interest of the rest of the UK. So, no, I don't think it's a good option.
Much of this audience, right, who was here,
the what?
Much of this audience that were here, right, at this one here, organised by the Herald, would also have been at the conference with yourself, question and answer session with yourself at the Barring Hall. And you said exactly that. You said that it was common sense.
Correct.
It made sense.
Yes. Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
Okay, straightforward dispute. He said it was common sense. What's your answer?
A currency union doesn't make any sense for Scotland or the rest of the United Kingdom. It is political nonsense, because your 2 parties are bound into a straitjacket where they potentially have a veto on each other's tax and spending, or whatever else that is. That's not independence. And it also, as we were talking about earlier, to expect the rest of the UK to fall into it without them even being asked just seems to me to be nonsense. And the second thing is, it just is not going to happen. And I've said repeatedly, if you're the only union supporting a currency that works is where you've got an economic and a political union. Now, I believe in an economic and political union. That is what the United Kingdom is, and that is a profound difference between me and those who argue that a currency union outside the United Kingdom.
Come on, no question over here.
James, my mother lived out her days in Canada on a UK pension, but as an expat she didn't receive the full pension. What I would like to know, Alistair, is how safe is my pension in an independent Scotland, being an expat for that time?
What? I mean, you just mean the state pension?
Yeah, the old age pension.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're a former working pension secretary.
Yeah, no, I thought you were going to have a go at me for the first part of it, the successive governments, the big issue about expats, Karen and I'll come as well. I think the issue of payment of pensions is one of the many great unanswered questions. One of the, if there was an independence vote, there would have to be a discussion as to who is paying the pension, because as you know, the state pension is funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. There isn't a pension fund. It's today's taxpayers pay for the pensions of people who have retired at pensionable age. And, for example, if you've got someone who say worked all their life in England, but they're retired to Glasgow, who's paying the pension? The Scottish government, or is it the UK government? I don't know the answer to that, because nobody can possibly work that out until they've had those discussions and some sort of agreement as to how you divide that up. There's a second thing in relation to occupational pensions and works pensions, which may or may not affect you, I don't know. But the European Union rules require that each member state fully funds its pension. So a lot of the cross-border funds that we've got at the moment would have to be fully funded, and someone would have to do that. And the choice is basically the members of that fund, in other words, the working population, or the government of the day, presumably the Scottish government. So those are issues which I can't answer because I'm not making the proposition that we should make we should have independence. But it's one of the huge questions that have to be determined because it affects an awful lot of people in this country.
One here, and then we'll come back down here. Yeah.
You made reference earlier to the Barnett formula and how Scotland, obviously, your words benefits from the Barnett formula. Ms Patel, a Tory backbencher, recently quoted in a speech just a few weeks ago saying that a no vote would be a fabulous opportunity. And I think I'm important to slash spending in Scotland. Could you respond to that, please? Because I think she might have let slip on what Mr. thinking.
Right.
Yeah, good question.
I don't know, and I don't agree with that. All I can say is that never mind the backbenchers, the front benches, all three parties have said the Barnett formula will continue. And actually, people have looked at it on and off over the last 30 years, and no one's come up with a better solution as to how you would fund the different parts of the United Kingdom. So it will continue. And it is a far better bet than relying on the uncertainty of North Sea oil revenues. I know you and I are never going to agree on that, but I just happen to think that's the case. I can understand why people praise Liz Patel, but I wouldn't if I were you.
Can I just ask you a question off the back of that? We heard from Gordon Brown earlier this week about what might happen after the new book. And we've heard from Lynn Campbell, and you say we're going to hear from Ed Miliband. How clearly do you think the picture of the effects of a no vote vis-à-vis any likely UK government after the 2015 general election are going to be by the time people come to cast a vote in Scotland? Because it is desperate
on the Constitution.
On the Constitution and how things will lie. Because you've said yourself, 1 in 4 people is undecided in your judgment. 1 million people, roughly speaking, of the voting population. They need to know. You made your point about the uncertainties of the Salmon proposals, and people will take a view of that. On your side, you've got to say, look, here's why you should trust what we say is going to happen. Because a lot of people say, well, hang on a minute, you haven't done it before. Why are you doing it now? Is it just because of the vote? How sure do you think Ed Miliband is going to be putting forward something which says, if I'm Prime Minister and there is a new vote, here is what you'll get? Will it be clear?
I think all three parties will have made their position clear by, I think the Tories are the last one in the early summer.
Yes.
So that will be clear. What I'd also say is, we've talked about the 1 in 4 people still going their minds up. It would be wrong to assume, because all the evidence is that the Constitution issue is not the big thing in their minds. It is an issue, of course a lot of interest in it, but they're also interested in what this would all mean for a standard of living, the job prospects and so on. So there's many other things in their minds as in relation to the Constitution. But the answer to your question is, yes, people will vote before they go to the polls.
Next one, which is here.
And thanks for an interesting discussion so far. Just to try and move on the currency union point a bit. If we take at face value what Osborne and Bills and so on have said, and there is no currency.
By so on, you mean Daniel?
Yeah.
Just balanced.
If we take them at their word and that's what happens after a yes vote, one of the first things that Nicola Sturgeon said when this position was announced that we put it back was that we would walk away from the share of the UK national debt. So would that be justified?
And what would the consequences be? I would certainly make for interesting discussion, because it is common ground from the Nationalist point of view that they would need the rest of the UK to both collect taxes and pay out welfare benefits for between 5 and 10 years. If you say, and by the way, we're not going to take on any debt, I can't see these discussions continuing with too much goodwill as far as that's concerned. The second thing is that if it was in their mind to have their own currency, if you've said in advance you're the sort of people that will default on your debt, it will mean that you will be charged a hell of a lot to borrow money, and all governments borrow money.
You mean on international markets?
Yeah, because they'll say, if you look, it's no great science here. You go look around kind of like Argentina, which doesn't entirely have a happy history as far as this is concerned, it pays an awful lot more to borrow money. The UK can borrow more cheaply than most other countries, partly because we borrow very long-term debt, and partly because we've never defaulted. And because default is now a live issue, especially in light of what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years, this is why countries, smaller countries, are more exposed. And why, if he starts saying, I'm not going to pay my debts, then it's not surprising people to say, well, it's going to charge you a bit more. What was that point?
It would be legal under international law, not to service that.
Well, I'm not sure you're right about that.
It's not up there.
Let me finish, and you know, Jen, I didn't get a microphone. If you just look at it this way, if you're a new country with a new currency, and your leader had been saying, I'm going to default on the debt, what do you think would be the reaction of somebody lending more money to this country?
Why do you use the word default?
Because the debt this country has was built up by the UK as a whole, and actually a large part of it just now was directly contributed to the collapse of 2 Scottish banks, so we can't say... It was.
Jeez, unbelievable. This is great.
Just I'm showing you this chance. If the countries are split, then as John Swinney has said in previous times, he would expect to take on a share of Scotland's debt. And if you walk away from that, you can call it default, call it what you like. It's just you're not paying something that I think most people would say you should be paying, and that you would suffer the consequences of it. It's just a fact of life, I'm afraid.
Right. Question over here. And then down.
Good evening. We speak, Mr. Darling, quite a lot about Scotland's finances with regards to the oil, and it's really important and all sorts of stuff. But Standard & Poor's came out last week and said, quote, even excluding North Sea output and calculating per capita GDP only by looking at onshore income, Scotland would qualify for our highest economic assessment, which we know the UK lost last year. They lost their triple credit rating. So, are they wrong?
What I would say to you is it's always a good idea in these things to read the whole report. Because if you read the whole report, see you're smiling, if you read the full report, it actually went on to say, but we still think there's an awful lot of risks here. What they didn't do was they weren't offering to give it a triple A rating or anything like that. There are actually only 2 countries at the moment that have got triple A ratings in the European Union. If you're a new kid in the block, the best will of the world, it's highly unlikely that you would get one. But if you read all ratings agencies that come out with stuff in the last month or so, Standard & Poor's, Fitch's, Moody's, and they've all said the same thing, that there are huge risks here. And so read all of it, not just 1 or 2 lines of it.
Question down here.
Hello, good evening. Actually, the constitutional question is on my mind, and nationalism and caving into it, and their rent-seeking behaviour, because since the 1970s, Tandy Earl seemed to be quite unusual in that he stood 4 square behind the Union, and his reasons were, and his predictions have come true, that it creates instability and insoluble constitutional problems, and that, in fact, a unitary state is not a bad thing. It's not a bad system of government.
Do you think Parliament should be?
Yes, I would not be. This notion that we have to keep caving into this rent-seeking behaviour, always grasping for more power. So we see this happening with Europe as well, such that Westminster is leeching powers away, which is not good for sovereignty and it's not good for democracy. And it doesn't. This devolution doesn't actually deliver the self-determination that it claims to. And in the context of a globalised economy, is incongruent with the direction of travel. So, what in that sense, if powers are leeching away in the context of the globalised economy and supranational bodies, what is the point of nationalism and the nation state? And is it not just a container of expediency?
What was the question? But you stuck to short questions.
I think it's perfectly possible, highly desirable, to have devolution of power within the United Kingdom. I've never seen it as something that would stop nationalism, because if you believe in Scotland should be a separate country, you believe that come what may, no matter what the consequences are. It's a new people are entitled to vote, not what I agree with obviously, but I don't see devolution in the light that you put it.
Do you think that where we are now with the 2012 Scotland Act and various promises that have been made and probably will continue to be made into the summer, that devolution or a change in the constitutional architecture of the UK has gone much further than you expected before you were in Parliament, let's say in the late 70s when the first devolution imbroglio boiled up? Has it been something that has surprised you, enlightened you, that it's gone further than you believed it would?
Well, going back to 1979 is difficult because really you haven't get very much beyond the first principles, if you like, and the precious little discussion that I recall about the big arguments whether or not universities, funding universities should be involved in how you engage that now. And things move on. I think it was ever thought that the 1998 Scotland Act was the end of the story. And look in Wales, for example, it has gone a lot further, and the process has gone a lot further. And there isn't nothing like the same pressure there. The Welsh nationalists tend not to be terribly pushy about the nationalist point. So, I think anyone looking at the world now, whether it's here at home, the constitutional setting or elsewhere, I don't think anyone should be surprised that things change possibly more rapidly than you thought. And after all, 20 years ago, I think many of us thought the Cold War was finished. Perhaps today we might not be looking at it quite so soundly.
Let's try and squeeze in 2 or 3 more before we have to come to a conclusion. Right. Who's got the mic? Somebody got it? Yeah, right, finally.
Michael Benedicte, my question is almost directed at both of you. There are serious questions being asked. Why is the Scottish National Party being allowed to get away with answers like scaremongering? They'll change their mind the following day. Why can't they be forced to answer the questions? Your interview with the First Minister on the Today programme, Mr. Naughty, was let him get away with all these. We never got...
Well, it's nice to be accused of being a nationalist undercover. Thanks very much. You try interviewing Alex Salmond in 8 minutes and see how you get on. Anyway, I'll let you answer.
Well, look, I dare say many people would point out that you can't force people to answer a question.
That's all, folks.
Let me just say something to you. There's something quite interesting about this. There is an assumption that if a politician, if it's him or Alex Salmond or whoever it happens to be, doesn't answer a question, then the interviewer has failed. And the assumption is that the listener does not notice that the person hasn't answered the question. In my experience, they notice perfectly well, as you have just demonstrated. People know perfectly well when someone is wriggling, whether it's, Alex Salmond, Alistair Darling, Margaret Thatcher or Mahatma Gandhi. When they're not answering a question, people know. And sometimes you feel it necessary to bash them and make the point fairly obvious. Sometimes you can just sit back and the listeners understand, and we do credit to the listeners, including yourself. You clearly have noticed that people in your judgment have not answered questions. I don't need to tell you. You can see it for yourself. That's my answer. Carry on.
I'm just going to say that there are many examples of politicians, myself included, being busy talking away and saying what you think, and saying, I wish you'd interrupt me so I could go on to something else. Jim is right. Sometimes people's silence is as eloquent as an answer. And on the currency point, it matters, because if we're not having the pound, what are we having? Because upon that depends the value of your savings, your ability to buy and sell things, the capability of creating wealth in the country in which we all want to do well. We need to know before we go. And there's no reason. Someone has got a plan B. He just won't tell us.
That's right.
And it's surely better than
what is his plan B?
Well, at the moment, it appears to be the Panama option. Why didn't he say that's where we're going to be? We're going to be like Panama, and people can judge.
What's your plan B for Faz Lane?
Yeah.
Let's have a quick word about defence.
Yeah,
actually. Somebody shouted Faz Lane there.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a shout. What are the options? We don't have them all. It's a huge subject. But NATO, Faz Lane, Trident. You've wrestled with the money for Trident. What are the options?
Well, the option, in terms of Trident, the option which I think the next staging post is, I think, at the beginning of the next Parliament rather than this one, as to whether or not we replace it with 4 operational submarines, or whether you have less than that. I suspect the guy who shouted knows I voted for the replacement of that with the basket at the House of Commons. And I rather thought the question was if we had independence. And I understand perfectly, if you think that it is wrong to have nuclear weapons, I understand this perfectly stateful position. But I can't see how at the same time you can say, but I want to join NATO, which is a nuclear alliance. And if submarines are wrong in the Clyde, they must be wrong in Barrow and Furness, or wherever else you chose to park them in the future. Now, there's a profound, there'll be differences in people in this room on what they think of our nuclear deterrence.
Yes.
And again, it's interesting going back to the attitudes in Scotland. Is it far more evenly divided division than I thought when I saw it? But what I do know is that if it goes, so will the rest of the submarine maintenance staff, and so will 8,000 jobs on the Clyde, which is a huge, huge loss.
Let's get a couple of last ones in. Who's got the mic? There, and then we'll have one here, and I think then we have to go.
Do you think the thing that might sway this referendum is the subject of greed? And by that I mean the greed that now emanates from the City of London.
Westminster, eh?
Where we have the arms dealers in cahoots with their political partners.
Yeah.
We have the bankers with their bonuses in cahoots with their political partners. We've got the greedy train of the House of Lords. And we've got the House of Commons, where many of their MPs supplicate their earnings with tens of thousands of pounds. The people of Scotland are fed up with this greed, and we want to live in a fairer society. We're voting no. I don't think we can get that.
Good man. Good man.
In relation to banks, some of the high salaries were also paid in banks that were based in Scotland. With people who, the Scottish politicians were quite happy to be seen around at the time. But the best way of dealing with bankers' bonuses and so on is it's the political will to tackle that rather than the constitutional arrangements. And I just, as I said earlier, I just don't buy this argument that if you just have a different constitutional arrangement, none of the things that you complain about that or anything else will suddenly go away. I just don't think that's the case.
Last couple, one here.
Yes, I come along this evening to hear hopefully an inspiring vision for the future of the Union. All I seem to have heard is a pitch for some sort of insurance policy inspiring. My question is this, Mr. Darling. Are considerable periods of Conservative government, the majority of my lifetime, a price worth paying for remaining in the Union?
As I said earlier, if you take this country, Scotland that is, I disagree with them, but more people voted for the Conservatives and Liberals than voted for the Nationalists. And in any elections, the problem with democracy is sometimes people elect governments that you don't like. I don't like the present government in Scotland, and I don't like the present government in Edinburgh. I don't like the one in Edinburgh. So I'm doubly disadvantaged, if you like. But I just simply don't buy this argument but we're also inherently different from our neighbours south of the border of Wales and Northern Ireland, and that justifies somehow splitting away. I'm not, maybe the impression, I'm not sure I'd ever convince you of the benefits, right? I just do think that being part of something bigger does enable Scotland to do better. But of course, yes, that does depend on having a government that is politically committed to making things better. And, as I said earlier, after the 19th of September, I'm very clear that I am actually campaigning for the return of a Labour government, because I think that will be better for Scotland and for the whole of the UK. Let me just ask you a last question. You're still ahead. How confident are you, really? I will not, to the state of blinding obvious, I won't be confident. I'm calling it. Obviously, I gave the wrong answer there. It's always nice to be in front rather than behind, but there's 6 months to go. There's 1 in 4 electors maybe haven't made their minds up. We don't know how many people will turn out on the day. A lot of things can happen in the next 6 months, that will help either side. And if you go into any election thinking other than the fact that it's going to be close, that you cannot possibly guarantee that you're going to win, you'll be very foolish indeed. So I will remain apprehensive. I shall remain nervous right up until the time that we get the result. You know your biggest problem, don't you? Which one in particular? England winning the World Cup.